Australia is a country known for its wonderfully unique and quirky wildlife. From the iconic mammals, to the deadly snakes, to the vibrant multicoloured birds, Australia's wildlife is like nothing else in the world. They form a huge part of our cultural identity, and people travel from all over the world just to catch a glimpse of them up close and in person. Without our wildlife, many argue that Australia just wouldn't be Australia. So why is it then that Australia is currently on the verge of a wildlife extinction crisis?
Sadly, I don't think there is enough being done. Australia's got the worst mammal extinction rate in the world. We've lost 30 mammals already, and that decline is ongoing. So we've actually got over 1,700 animals and plants that are currently threatened with extinction. And even our most iconic, most heavily protected national park with the biggest budget, so Kakadu hasn't escaped. So in the last 15 years, Kakadu's lost 90% of its threatened species, and Kakadu's not alone. So our national parks around the country are leaking species. In fact, Tim Flannery has described our national parks as marsupial ghost towns because they're just empty landscapes.
So how did this happen? Where did it all go wrong? Dr. Matthew Crowther, Senior Lecturer in the School of Biological Sciences at the University of Sydney, puts it down to three key factors.
There's three major threats to me. Loss of habitat is always going to be a threat, whether it's through development, whether it's through mining, whether it's through agriculture, whether it's through fragmentation of the habitat itself, roads, any railways, any other major threat. So that's probably one of the major threats, loss of habitat. But the other ones, of course, invasive species that I mentioned, foxes, cats, cane toads, a range of other species, feral pigs, possibly buffalo, all are major threats to the ecosystems. And we're only quite beginning to see, like we're seeing with our koala research, the impacts of climate change, which is a bit scary in that we don't know exactly how it's happening, but we know that some of those changes appear to be taking place. And so they'll interact with the other two changes I mentioned and could have a severe effect on a vast range of our flora and fauna.
The clearing of land and native vegetation has played a huge role in the decline of our wildlife. When land is cleared for commercial use, many are left without a home. Only recently did these heartbreaking images emerge of a young female koala named Ash, wandering disoriented in the middle of a development site on the northern end of the Gold Coast. Poor fire regimes and road incidents have also contributed to this decline. When it comes to our smaller native mammals, however, one threat stands out among the rest: feral cats and foxes. According to the Australian Wildlife Conservancy, every night across Australia, feral cats kill an estimated 75 million native animals. The severity of this threat is only growing, and major moves are being made to counteract it. One such move includes the implementation of feral cat and fox-free areas by the Australian Wildlife Conservancy.
So the fence is 6 feet high, it's got an overhang and an underskirt, it's electrified, but it encloses a very, very large area. So for instance, at Scotia in outback New South Wales, we've established a cat fox-free area there. The fence runs for 53 kilometres and encloses an 8,000 hectare area. That's larger than the size of your average national park. So within those areas, they'll be completely free of cats, foxes, goats, sheep, rabbits, but hopefully in time they'll be full of native animals.
A lack of funding from the Australian government is also contributing to the rapid decline in our wildlife, particularly with regards to research into deadly contagious diseases. Australia's iconic Tasmanian devil is testament to this. The species is faced with possible extinction as a result of a deadly, highly contagious, transmissible cancer known as the Tasmanian devil facial tumour disease.
Well, the disease arose around about 20 years ago in the northeast of Tasmania, and within a few years it just spread rapidly throughout the eastern populations. It wiped out up to 95% of devils in those populations. So it's really been a massive impact, and this is because it's a transmissible cancer. So transmissible cancers are really, really rare in the wild. There's only 2 other known cases, one in dogs and one that they've just found in clams, which is really unusual. So cancers aren't usually transmitted between individuals, but this cancer has developed a way of evading the immune system. So when devils bite each other, they actually transmit that infection. They are working on a vaccine for the disease at the moment, and there's a vaccine trial happening right now. So they have vaccinated some animals and released them into the wild, and they're monitoring them to see how they go. It's really at the trial stage at the moment, and some researchers in Tasmania are working on that. So they're going to see how those devils do in the wild, whether they end up contracting the disease or how they respond.
While these trials are a huge step forward for the devil, Belinda Wright believes that further funding is still required in order to get the job done. She also believes that the conservation of the devil is of vital importance.
I think that preserving biodiversity is one of the most important things to protecting our own future as well. We need to learn to be sustainable, and diversity is part of sustainability. So the other thing is that the Tasmanian devil is a top order predator in Tasmania. So because in the wild it keeps control of numbers of cats and foxes, they think. Though they haven't got conclusive evidence of foxes in Tasmania, but there could be an impact of taking Tasmanian devils out of the wild, that the numbers of foxes and cats increase. So that can have massive impacts on the other fauna in the area as well.
While Australia currently has the worst mammal extinction rate in the world, it isn't just these Australian creatures that are suffering. The corroboree frog is one of Australia's most iconic amphibian species, and is among the most visually spectacular frogs in the world. They are also one of Australia's most endangered species, and are facing extinction because of yet another deadly disease.
Yeah, but both northern and southern corroboree frog species are critically endangered. The southern corroboree frog species, left in the wild, I would say, depends how you say it. In terms of wild frogs still remaining, last year we only had 2 colony male southern corroboree frogs remaining, and 2 females worth of clutches in a nest. So as far as we know, there's only 4 remaining frogs at historic sites. So for the southern corroboree frog, the main threat facing this species is chytrid fungus, or chytridiomycosis, which is an introduced disease. It got to Australia in the mid-1970s, and in Australia so far, it's wiped out 6 species that we're aware of, that haven't been seen for at least kind of 10, 15, even 30 years. And in Central America, it's wiped out at least 150 to 160 species of frogs. So worldwide, there's probably about 200 species of frogs that have disappeared due to the same threat that's taking out the southern corroboree frog. And cause their decline. And there's a lot of other species, including in Australia, we have at least 4 or 5 that are right on the brink of extinction at the moment.
Michael McFadden is the supervisor of the Herpetofauna department at Taronga Zoo, and works very closely with these frogs. Taronga is one of 4 institutions in Australia participating in a major captive breeding program that has become vital to saving this species. The program involves the housing of these frogs in specialised climate-controlled facilities that are designed to closely replicate the cool, semi-alpine environment of their natural habitat. While Michael believes the captive breeding program has been a success, it is still too early to see how successful the reintroduction of these frogs has been into the wild.
Yeah, the captive program has been quite a success so far. We've established breeding protocols quite early on. Each year, here at Melbourne Zoo, we have at least 60 to 70% of our females laying eggs every year. So we're having lots of success. The mortality rate within the frogs is really low. So the survival of these frogs and how they're doing in captivity at the zoo is awesome. They're doing great, they're breeding well, they're all healthy frogs, and we're breeding them quite well for reintroduction. In terms of the reintroduction program, it's still far too early to say whether it's a success or not. We know some of the first reintroduced frogs are turning back up, but really we need at least another 4 or 5 years of data to work out roughly how it's going. But every year, it's a dynamic program. Every year we fine-tune our techniques. We're trialling at least 4 different reintroduction strategies at the moment, so that way all our eggs aren't in one basket. We're trialling a range of strategies in an experimental fashion, so that way we'll be able to work out whether or not things are working, whether or not they're not, and how to focus on the successful aspects of the program. But it's still too early yet to say whether the reintroduction program has been a success.
So, if we know what's threatening our wildlife, and we have a chance to fix it, why has the situation become so dire? Jess Uliano, Wildlife Sydney Zoo employee and co-founder of the Wildlife Conservation Fund, believes it all comes down to a lack of awareness and Australia's general attitude towards the environment.
Yeah, I think that's a major problem when it comes to endangered species in Australia. It's not so much the actual threats themselves, like obviously deforestation, introduction of invasive predators is like a big problem, but that's not the main issue. The biggest issue we have is people's attitudes about conservation, and most of the time it just comes from a lack of education. If people aren't aware that something is critically endangered or going to be extinct, they obviously can't help. You can't help a problem that you don't know exists. So that's the main role, just raising awareness and trying to teach people that it is an issue of importance. I think a lot of the time, because it is such a well-known thing that we are having crises as far as, like, you know, the next mass extinction on the planet, let alone just with mammals in Australia. So people are a bit sick of it. They're like, okay, we get it, everything's dying, it's all our fault as humans, but it's just that whole attitude should change. And it's like, no, we can actually do something about this, we can stop it, and it's right here in Australia, it's close to home, it's not happening out there in the world, it's here, right in Sydney at times, so.
She also believes that wildlife conservation is of secondary concern to most Australians, who are too busy worrying about other, more economic and politically driven issues.
I think that our society as a whole doesn't value environmental issues as they do economic issues or other political matters, and it's just our culture and the environment is always seen to be as secondary, and I think that's really changing. In the past 20 years you can see, even with other issues such as climate change and stuff, there's been a big push to get that in the agenda, I think was their little motto. It's the same with our Australian wildlife. I mean, Australia is so lucky. We have some of the most unique animals you can't find anywhere else on the planet. I think there's 1 million native species in Australia or something ridiculous like that. And I think it needs to start with the government, because if they take responsibility and say, hey, we have a moral obligation as the leaders of this country to conserve our wildlife, then that'll kind of filter into the media and then the general population. But at the moment, you'll just find that everyone's happy to help the environment and do their bit, but it's secondary to every other matter in their life. And that really needs to change in order to really attack this issue that we have right at the moment with this mass extinction coming up.
Dr. Matthew Crowther echoes these views.
I believe a lot of Australians are much more aware than they used to be. They are concerned. They do like wildlife. They do like animals. If you ask the average person, no matter what background they come from, they like animals. They like nature. But the problem is they're faced with other factors in their life, and certain governments and industry are pushing other factors, such as, well, you might not have a job if this doesn't go through, or you won't be able to have a house. And so that's more immediate concern to most of the Australian population, unfortunately.
With scientists predicting the 6th mass extinction phase on the planet, there is only a small window of time in which Australia can act. Greater awareness, further funding, and a change in attitude is all that is needed to help save our beloved wildlife. These creatures play such a huge role in so many aspects of life, and conserving them is of vital importance.
The first and foremost, and what I believe, and actually a lot of Australians do believe, is they have an intrinsic right to survive. We've got to think about different issues. When we talk about different people, we also have to talk about different value sets across biodiversity. Biodiversity in itself, I believe, as do many other people, have an intrinsic right. But even if you have to look at it more from an application type of view, biodiversity supplies ecosystem services, everything from pollination, which we need for agriculture, to digging holes by the mammals that encourage other plant growth. So they've got ecosystems. We have direct economic, whether we're developing drugs for medical purposes, whether we're using timber resources, whether we're using fisheries. There's either direct or indirect uses to us economically. Plus there's major cultural. It's important. Koalas are an iconic species to us as a nation. People come in to see them. So there's a cultural and direct economic benefit to having biodiversity and conserving biodiversity.
I always kind of say it's kind of like the same argument with history. So it's like, why should we preserve a historical ruin? Why should we conserve a species of animal? It's just a moral thing, and it comes down to it. Like, you can put down the scientific arguments, you could talk about how it's better for people's well-being to be in a healthy ecosystem, which is very diverse in animal populations. But when it comes down to it, we're here in Australia, we're ultimately the ones who are responsible for these animals, and it's kind of like, how can you call yourself an Australian and be proud to live in this country if you're not going to do anything to help conserve the wildlife, which is half the time what makes it what we are. You know, when people think of Australia, they think kangaroo, koala, the amazing outback, that beautiful Daintree rainforest, and imagine if all that was gone, what would we really have left?